Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is HawkCast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Hawkeye Beacon and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined as always by publisher Adam Jacoby and managing editor of the site, Ross Binder. Before we get started, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, drop a like, drop a comment. Let us know what you thought about Big Ten Media Days. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you might be listening but not subscribed. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Leave that rate and review while you're there as well. That helps us out a lot, and it does make us very happy. Of course, coming off Big Ten Media Days in Indianapolis, always an enjoyable time getting to cover not only the Hawkeyes, but the myriad of other teams in the Big Ten. USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon, now part of the Big Ten, which was just a trip. If you follow me on Twitter, which you should, you saw the picture I got of Lincoln Riley. We definitely live in a simulation. That's all I'm saying. Now, Iowa specific. Not only did we get Kirk, Luke Lachey, Jay Higgins, and Quinn Schulte, but we got depth chart as well, like right before Kirk went on stage or went up on the podium, right, Adam?
Yeah, like within about 15 or 20 minutes. And it just like popped up on Twitter and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, they sent out an email too. It was just like a mic drop that, hey, check this out. That'll be fun, which it was. So appreciate it to Hawkeye football. A lot of really interesting stuff on this pre-camp depth chart. And I think the number one thing that people are talking about right now that really does have an impact and probably will affect like the way the team looks this year is that John Nestor is starting cornerback 2 opposite of Jermari Harris, not Deshaun Lee, not TJ Hall, John Nestor right there. He's also the backup cash, which we'll talk about that momentarily, but like I guess Iowa's willingness to do this now and not just have the incumbent Deshaun Lee as cornerback 2. Like, Ross, I'll go to you. What does that say to you here about John Nestor and what he did during the spring and what he's continued to do through the summer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take it as a sign that Nestor has just really been excelling during spring practice, during, the summer workouts and drills. We saw him play in, I think, every game last season or almost every game he was on special teams. So he developed that trust on that level. But, obviously, yeah, to see him listed as a starter at cornerback and the backup cash is that's a pretty high elevation for him from, just a special teams dude last year. And, we heard a lot of good things about him. You guys can attest to this from talking to the players. That's come through a lot. So I don't think anyone was surprised to see him, obviously on the depth chart, but to see him on top and as a starter, from, go as it looks right now is definitely, that's a pretty impressive sign that he's got to really be balling out because Phil Parker is certainly not one to just hand out starting jobs in the secondary to guys who haven't earned it.
Yeah, especially in July. And so I actually asked Quinn Schulte about that during the individual podiums. And his response was, coach says it every year, whenever he released a depth chart, it doesn't really matter. And that can look a lot different in a couple weeks or by the end of the season. So I think it's just important for everyone to just kind of, take it with a grain of salt and not really worry so much about it. Thanks, Quinn. Thanks a lot. Like, I get the sentiment too, and I get why a coach would say that. But it does seem notable that Nestor would have worked his way into that position, especially with a few weeks before the season. And when I talked with Jarriett Buie at the last media availability before media days, and I asked him about the guys that had, provided the most competition lining up against him at receiver. First name he mentioned was Nestor. And that's not the first time that we've heard a receiver mention Nestor as really taking that leap in practice, even just going back to Big Ten prep and bowl prep at the end of last season. His name started to come up more and more and more. So it's not necessarily a surprise per se. And as Quinn Schulte will tell you, it's not necessarily, set in stone or anything like that. So shame on us for talking about it, I suppose, but it does really seem like the culmination of a lot of hard work for Nestor in practice. It seems like it's pretty well earned. And then ultimately also, we're not really living in a world where teams trot out only two wide receivers a whole lot anymore. Right. So this isn't horrible news for TJ Hall or for Deshaun Lee, or any of that. And the fact that they've got the versatility clearly to move Nestor over to the cash means that if something bad happens to, Sebastian Castro, knock on wood that it doesn't, that Iowa's still in good, capable, experienced hands once you start to go down that cornerback depth chart. And I think that is as notable as, Nestor having that starting spot. But Nestor having that starting spot is notable, despite what some of the secondary might say.
One thing I'll say here is that it would have been very easy for whether it's Kirk Ferentz or whoever puts the depth chart together for release to do what they did. And again, we'll talk about this here in a moment between Marco and Brendan Sullivan being 2 and 3 on the depth chart at quarterback. It would have been very easy for them to just leave Deshaun Lee as the opposite starting corner, because that's what he was at the end of the season with Cooper out. And so again, I think that's very telling. Like we'll see what it turns out to be at the beginning of the season. But at the same time, too, Adam, you mentioned that it's not often that it's just two receivers out there. But we also have to remember Sebastian Castro plays in coverage quite a bit. So maybe that means that 3-4 corner isn't going to see the field near as much as maybe he could if it was a traditional 4-3 that Phil Parker was running out there for the defense. But it's more of a 4-2-5, right? So, but at the same time, you mentioned depth. That was something that Kirk mentioned in the local beat writers scrum, is he wasn't sure about the depth going into this year at corner, but now he's pretty damn confident in it. So I think that not only speaks to Nestor and his rise, but also Deshaun Lee, not even maybe just maintaining what he was last year. Because last year, I mean, he wasn't Cooper DeJean, right? Nobody else is Cooper DeJean, but he was good.
Right.
He was serviceable. And I think it speaks to the elevation of TJ Hall and the consistency of TJ Hall to continue to grow, despite getting torched in that Nebraska game a couple years ago, right?
Yeah, when I was talking with Jarriett, he had mentioned two names. One of them was John Nestor, the other was TJ Hall. So, and that one was a little bit begrudging, but in a friendly competition sort of way. So we know that Hall is on the rise too. The other three guys at corner we've already mentioned. I think Iowa's in pretty darn good shape, and we're not even talking about, again, like you mentioned, Sebastian Castro, or even for that matter, Cohen Niencher. So, I think they have reason to feel better about the secondary than they did in, say, December of 23.
Which, by the way, I wanted to mention Cohen Niencher here while we're talking about the defensive backs, because he is really the only one who hasn't been able to participate in football-related activity right now. He did have off-season surgery. They haven't really specified what that injury was, but he didn't go through the spring. He hasn't done much this summer, and now he's still working on his way back. But Kirk said he's on the faster trajectory more than on, a slower trajectory. If I had to guess, I don't know if you guys would hop on board here, but if I had to guess, Cohen would be considered the backup cash here if he were healthy. He's the backup strong safety, I think, behind Xavier. I gotta look.
Yeah, yep, he is. I just looked on the depth chart. Yeah, he
okay.
is.
And Zach Lutmer behind Quinn?
Yeah.
There you go. So Cohen backup strong safety despite being hurt. I don't know who that would be in a scenario if Cohen isn't ready to play this year. Who is that backup strong safety? Do you guys, I mean, do they move John over there, considering he's got the flexibility to play cash? Like, is he capable of playing that strong safety, or is it like Jermari because he's been in the defense for a long time and you can throw Deshaun at corner? Like, where do they go if Cohen's not available?
I think that's sort of the quote good problem to have, because there's a lot of guys with versatility. Nestor was the first name that popped up, and honestly, I think I was expecting to see him as a backup safety before a backup cash. So you can tell that clearly they're seeing him at a bunch of different positions in that secondary. The fact that he has earned his way to the top of the rotation at cornerback, at least for now, at least for July, sort of speaks to where his best strengths are. But, you know, you go to war with the army you've got, not the army you want. And once those injuries start to pile up, especially as that season goes on, if they need Nestor somewhere else, they've got the depth at cornerback to be able to move him around. But he's clearly a guy that they have identified as someone who really needs to be on the field. And again, that's consistent with everything that we've heard from his teammates over the last few months.
I think Kale Kolarik made the depth chart a few times last year at safety.
He did.
So, you know, if something happened, he would probably be in that mix too of guys that could, you know, potentially play. And then maybe Lutmer can play, you know, if he's back up free safety, it's going to be impossible for him to possibly spell at strong safety too. But
Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We don't want to.
and we hope we don't have to.
Right, exactly. Wampa, I mean, and we could be talking about the future too, because Wampa may well be heading to the NFL after this season too.
There could be a lot of starting spots opening in that secondary next year. I mean, Castro, Harris, and Schulte are all seniors or grad students, for God's sake.
Right.
And you say, yeah, I said X has, you know, if he has a great year, it's not impossible he could go as well. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for younger guys coming up soon.
That defense is going to look completely different next season. And once again,
Yes.
we will cross that bridge when we get to it. I promise. Going to be more than likely one of the best in the country once again this year. And that's a point that I made in a premium article, which of course you can check out at Hawkeye Beacon, iowa.rivals.com, is that if Nestor is anywhere near approaching what Cooper was last year, or just being one of the better corners in the conference, that defense maintains its elite status. Not that it wouldn't without him being that good, but like taking it to that next level. If John really has reached that next level in his second year, like, man, it's going to be hard to move the football against Iowa. We got to talk about the defensive line depth a little bit here, but it will be difficult if Nestor reaches that next level. And why don't we just jump to that right now? Because that's something that was talked about and has been talked about. We know that from talking to folks around the program too. They wanted to dip into the portal. They were looking at a few players. One was a D2 defensive tackle that went to Louisiana State or LSU. And another one was Wyoming. He ended up at USC. So it just didn't come to fruition. And right now we're looking at Jeremiah Pittman being really the only backup defensive lineman that has some serious playing time in his back pocket. Max Llewellyn did a little bit last year too, but really it's the starting four in Deontay Craig, Aaron Graves, Y.A. Black, and Ethan Herkett, and then Jeremiah Pittman and Max Llewellyn. But after that, it's a bunch of question marks. Like we've seen Brian Allen show some flashes. I'd really like to see him maybe play that 3-tech defensive tackle spot, but he's probably going to stick around defensive end. At least that's what Kirk said. Other than that, so he'd be the backup behind Ethan Herkett, who's going to be good, I think. But defensive tackle, man, is a question mark. That is a huge question mark. You've got scholarship DT and Jeff Bowie, and then 2 walk-ons and Luke Gaffney and Caden Crawford. I'm sorry, not Caden Crawford, Will Hubert. And if they got to roll with it, they've got to roll with it. But man, it just hasn't been a question mark for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was just going to point out is that they've been able to go 4 or 5 guys deep at defensive tackle for the last, 3-4 years pretty consistently and not have much of a drop off, which really keeps you playing at a high level, throughout the game. And now, we just don't know because these guys just have not played very much. And yes, but they're going to need somebody, some guys are going to have to step up and produce for that defense to maintain the level it's been at because, Graves and Black, you don't want them playing, just all the snaps or they're going to be, dead by November basically. And that's not going to work.
They're bona fide NFL guys. Like YA and Aaron Graves will find themselves on an NFL roster, whether a guy like YA reaches that second contract. Aaron Graves is just too athletic and too smart to not reach something like that, at least in my opinion, barring injury and all of that. YA probably he's just a monster. Like we saw him kill a guy against Wisconsin last year, right? Like, but anyway, with players like that, of course you want them on the field, but just the way Iowa's defense operates, you want to have that security blanket. You want to be able to get them off the field and trust that second unit. You can do that to a degree with Jeremiah Pittman, but it's not going to be elite level play. Like we're not talking about Lucas Van Ness, who never started a game at Iowa, going in the first round of the NFL draft. Like it's just not that type of depth.
Yeah, we mentioned these guys sort of tiring out by November. It's a little bit, shorter than that. You worry about these guys tiring out by the fourth quarter because, Graves is all of a sudden, big enough that he's on the higher side of 300. YA has always been that big. And that, stacking dozens upon dozens upon dozens of snaps on those legs, it's math as much as anything. Like trying to move your own 300 pounds that much and not really having that sort of respite coming off the bench, especially when that respite's playing at a high level, like you mentioned, Van Ness, or when Graves was the guy coming off the bench, that is, having that weapon with fresh legs coming in that second or third quarter, one, not only preserves your starters, but two, keeps that pressure on opposing linemen as the game goes on. And how many times have we seen Iowa just wear out opposing lines? And that's primarily a function not only of talent, of course, but of depth. And so there's real strategic benefit to getting, not only Pittman, but Gaffney, and hopefully some of those guys behind them, playing at not only able to be on the field level, but able to punish opposing offensive lineman level. That is going to be the big key for this defensive line. And if for no other reason that you can't really find many other like weak points on this defense as a whole. So if Iowa shorts that up, I mean, this defense is going to be a monster. If not, there's your lone attack point. And even then, like we're pointing at an attack point that has YA Black and Aaron Graves at the front of it. Like, so good luck there. But yeah, Iowa absolutely needs to get that little bit of step up and confidence in its backups on that line.
Now on to the next point here on that depth chart. Not really a whole lot else to talk about defensively, at least in this first glance. Do you guys see anything else on the depth chart in terms of the defense that is maybe either a surprise or a question mark? Because I don't. I mean, I'm intrigued by Kenneth Merriweather, who's a redshirt freshman. I'm excited to see what he can be. But again, redshirt freshman. We are talking about the defensive line depth. I don't know that he's ready. Same for Caden Crawford, who's a sophomore. But no more question marks or anything notable for me on that defensive depth chart. So move to the offense.
Yeah.
I mean, they're returning, you pointed this out in an article, and they're returning 8 guys on defense. So there just aren't a lot of questions to be had right now about at least the starters. We don't know, you talk about the depth at defensive tackle, the depth at linebacker is a little better, but also those guys just haven't played a lot because, Jackson and Higgins have been there and been doing it for, Jackson just last year, but there just haven't been a ton of opportunities. But I think, you do feel better about guys like Jaden Harrell if they do get, called into action. But
Rex Roth, Shire. Yeah. Those guys were awesome in the spring game. I think it was Rex Roth who got his jersey ripped in half or whatever it was, and Shire had a pick 6. And yeah, those guys are legit. Now, from one question mark to lots of question marks on the offense here. Let's start with the main thing at that quarterback position, and that's Marco Lainez being QB2 right ahead of Brendan Sullivan, who is QB3, ahead of this pre-camp depth chart that was released a couple days ago. I think it's pretty simple. Said this on Condon and Miller yesterday on KXNO. I think you guys are going to agree. This is just the fact that Marco had a spring. He had a ton of reps as the 2 and the 3 quarterback throughout the spring, and Brendan Sullivan just got here. Brendan Sullivan is going to be quarterback 2 by game 1. Like, I just don't see any way, any if, ands, or buts about it.
Yeah, I asked Kirk about that in his sort of open part of the press conference, and he mentioned that, Sullivan might as well be number 2. It's just that he hasn't been wearing a helmet for the Hawkeyes yet, and like he said, Lainez had that spring. So I do expect that move, and he even, I mean, the fact that he said, like, yeah, we could have put Sullivan at the 2. Right, that sort of shows that it's almost like a delineation without a difference. So I do expect that to be to sort of shake itself out. But one thing he also mentioned was it's a fluid situation, it's a competition. McNamara has an advantage, but the starting job isn't necessarily his yet. That this is a competition that all 3 of those quarterbacks, and he made sure to mention that it was going to be the 3 of them, all 3 can compete for. And we've already heard from Sullivan. We've already heard from McNamara. We haven't gotten to meet with Lainez this offseason yet. Otherwise, obviously he would have gotten some questions about that. But we've heard that they are welcoming that competition, that they are strengthening their bonds through that competition, which is the hallmark of a good teammate and exactly what you would want from a quarterback. But yeah, this is, I think this is actually the appropriate point to like throw in Quinn Schulte's sort of remarks about like, well, depth charts only mean so much. Like, this is the perfect example of that, because yeah, I do expect Sullivan to move to at least that number 2. And once these guys are able to put the pads on, once we start to see those 11 on 11s and really those few weeks of full go practice, we'll start to see, how close or not close this competition is. I think it's going to be very interesting to see, but my guess would be just like you guys. It goes McNamara, Sullivan, Lainez by week 1. And I'm not sure there's really anybody that expects otherwise at this point. But the fact that Ferentz mentioned a couple times in his answer that there's no incumbents, that this is a competition, was in and of itself a little bit notable to me. Ellie, do you agree?
Well, I think the way that we've described it to this point is it's Cade's job to lose. And I think that, I mean, that's what I got from Kirk as well.
More or
Are
less,
they,
yeah.
are they welcoming competition? Yes, but it is Cade's job. And the other thing is that Kirk in that local media scrum said, like, I didn't even talk to Cade about it when they brought Brendan in, which was kind of a surprise to me. But and that might also be Kirk blowing some smoke up our butts. But he also said that Cade hasn't looked backwards. Cade is just forward, and it is not a second thought for him. And I think that's Cade's personality, 1. But 2, I also think it's an indication of him having the job. Will there be an open competition? And I put that in quotes for those of you who are listening. Yes and no. That's the way I look at it, because they want to give Brendan, they want to give Marco reps. They want to give him an opportunity, but man, it's going to be hard to get that job, take the reins away from Cade. That's the way I've gathered that situation.
And that's kind of where I'm coming from, because like, what does competition look like? Who's getting the reps with the ones on offense? And it's hard for me to see anyone but Cade getting the vast majority of those. Like, to me, it's not really an open competition unless Sullivan and I guess Marco, Lainez are also getting some reps with the ones. And I don't know that I have a lot of confidence in that happening right now. So I am curious to see what that looks like and who's actually getting those reps, who's getting to run with the first team on offense. And, you want a competition, but you also want a quarterback who's going to be prepared for the season. And, Cade missed a lot of last year. He hasn't run, Lester's offense yet. So you want him to, if he is the guy, you want him to be getting as many of those snaps as possible too.
That is exactly what I was going to mention. They don't really have the luxury of trying out backups playing with the ones when we've got a brand new offensive coordinator in Iowa City. We've got a QB who did not, get to have those 11 on 11 practices for more than 3 weeks. of all of 2023, so he needs to get ingratiated with the rest of the offense. He needs to get ingratiated with the scheme. So my guess is, unless something bad happens again, which again, knock on wood that it doesn't, but unless unless that happens, you really do sort of need McNamara to be practicing with the ones, just for his sake, for the rest of the offense's sake, for everybody's sake. So the experimentation and all that is something that I think that they kind of probably wish they could, but probably won't be dipping their toes into.
And this is just conjecture, this is just how I assess the situation. Tim Lester knows that Cade is his best quarterback. Tim Lester knows that, well, in the spring, there's a reason Deacon isn't on the roster anymore, right? There's a reason Marco isn't. He was 2 and 3, and I mean, it was getting reps right in the spring. And Tim Lester knows what he's got in Cade, and Cade is a quarterback who has won games, who can manage that RPO heavy scheme. He can make decisions. He can make post snap decisions. He can be your point guard. And he, like, in the spring, he looked like a quarterback. Like, I'll say that. And Tim Lester's, from what we've been able to gather so far, smart, and he is inclined to make the best decisions for the offense. And I don't know that I could say that about the previous offensive coordinator.
Yeah. And one other thing that Kirk mentioned a couple times, especially in that podium session, was this is going to be Cade's first time fully healthy in an Iowa uniform. What we saw from him in 2023 was, I think Kirk even declined to put a percent on it, but if just off of the eye test, I think he was at about 60% at best. Certainly he didn't have that footwork, didn't have his legs under him, wasn't able to be the Cade McNamara that, took Michigan to a Big Ten championship. So it'll be interesting to see now that McNamara is, again, healthy, and again, knock on wood that holds up for over the course of the season. But what does a 100% Cade McNamara look like in this Iowa offense, especially in this new Iowa offense? And we will get to see that and sort of readjust expectations accordingly off that. But that is still an unknown quantity of sorts, but certainly something that Kirk and the staff believe in him being better. Like, they believe that he's a lot better fully healthy than he was last season, and they think that that's going to show up in his production. So let's see it.
Sticking through the air, another really unknown position is the wide receiver position, especially now at the beginning of the season with no Caleb Brown for game 1, which we confirmed with Kirk. No first game of the season. He will be suspended. They're just going forward. You can read more about that on iowa.rivals.com, Hawkeye Beacon. Now, very tip top of the depth chart on the offensive side of things is Jarriett Buie at wide receiver. So that, and there's 3 separate receiver spots. There's not 2, there's 3. And they go Jarriett Buie, Dayton Howard. Next one is Seth Anderson, Caden Weegan. And the last one is Caleb Brown, Terrell Washington Jr. No Jacob Gill. Jacob Gill will probably fill that void of Caleb Brown being out in that first game. And I would expect him to be part of that group of 6 sooner rather than later on the 2 deeps.
I was surprised he wasn't listing when you've got 6 receivers on the 2 deeps, especially at Iowa, where there's not much experience among those guys. I was surprised not to see Gill there, but it also seems like the reason Sullivan is the 3 on the quarterback depth chart is
exactly
he's never played with an Iowa helmet or practiced with an Iowa helmet. So I fully expect him to be on those 2 deeps after, training camp or before the season gets started.
Yeah, I think it's...
and if that's...
Go ahead, Adam.
If that's the case, if he does work his way into that, my guess would be that he would take over TJ Washington's spot in the depth chart, if only because, one, we heard Kirk Ferentz mention Dayton Howard by name in terms of making those plays in practice, really making that leap. And we've seen him already put his trust in Caden Weegan last year when Weegan was a freshman. And so we know, especially at this point in the offseason, how much he values trust and, and prior experience and all that. So if I had to guess, if and when Gill works his way into those two deeps, it'll be, almost at Washington's expense. But there's a lot of moving parts still, and it's a brand new offense, and so this is also going to come down to fit within the offense as much as what they did in years past with a different coordinator running things.
The other thing too is based on the personnel and what Tim Lester has done, you can have like 3 or 4 gadget guys who can run the ball, who can catch the ball in space and make plays. And that's TJ Washington, that's Caleb Brown, that's Caden Weegan, and probably more than likely Jacob Gill too. And maybe even Seth Anderson. We saw him do some of those end arounds, jet sweep things last year that Brian Ferentz absolutely loved to run. And it wouldn't surprise me if Seth Anderson was in that group too. You're not going to see Jarriett Buie or Dayton Howard do that. They're more of the X receivers, specifically Dayton, more of an X receiver. But like you said, Adam, Dayton was brought up unprompted by Kirk. And I think that's a pretty solid indication of where Iowa's at with their 2 redshirt freshman receivers. Alex Moda, not on this depth chart either, the 2 deeps.
One more name to throw into the gadget guy sort of mix, Kamari Moulton. I know that they've got a little appreciation for his versatility too. So, do we see him used in a few, exotic for running back sort of ways? That is a way to get him on the field, especially with that loaded depth chart at running back that he's actually part of now.
Yeah, and that's something we got to talk about too, is that it's LaShawn Williams, Caleb Johnson, and Kamari Moulton, no longer Jazz Patterson on the depth chart for running backs. And I think that's one indicative of Kamari and what he's capable of and what he did this offseason. But we got a flash of Jazz Patterson at the beginning of the year last year. Then he got hurt. I think he had an ankle. And then we just really didn't see much of him. My last memory of Jazz Patterson at the end of the season was him split out wide when Iowa was running 5 wide against Tennessee. Like the memories that I do have of Jazz are Iowa State because of that big long run he had, and 2 when he took out 2 pass rushers as a pass blocker, which was sick. But I think you mentioned Kamari as a potential gadget guy. I think that's why. I mean, added weight, all those other things, growth as a player, maturity, what have you. But that's probably another reason why he surpassed Jazz Patterson on the depth chart, because Jazz Patterson is a hard runner. Like, you do not want to run into that dude. But that's kind of it, right? I mean, he's head down through hits the hole hard, and you love that. But Kamari can do that, and he can do all the versatile things too. And that's, no slam against Jazz Patterson. I couldn't do what he does. I mean, golly, I'd get, destroyed. But I imagine that's an element as to why Kamari got put at RB3.
Yeah, it's sort of a thing where anymore when you hear, I'll make a basketball comparison here, but when you hear guys talked about as like true 5s or true point guards or whatever anymore in basketball, what that really means is it's a limited skill set, right? Because the best point guards, the best 5s are the ones that have versatility now, whereas guys that have very concentrated skill sets, they're the pure passers. And from what we've seen from Patterson on the field last year and sort of the scouting that preceded him, that he was more of a pure power runner, which is great. And 20 years ago, that gets you on the field, that gets you a starting spot, that gets you 1,000 yards. Anymore, especially in this like RPO, more involved, intricate offense, you got to do a lot more. And we already saw sort of the seeds of them trusting Moulton last year, both in the pass game and the run game. And yeah, like you said, seeing him elevated to the number 3, and we know that Liddell Betts likes to use a deep backfield. Seeing him elevated to that, I think, is a reflection of the wider skill set that Moulton's got. And, he's just good. he's a good, athletic, talented runner. You just want the ball in his hands and see what happens.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with that and note that, in the more modern offenses, somebody like Patterson, is really more of a specialist. He does one thing or maybe one or two things, does them well, but he doesn't have that range of skills that someone like Moulton sure seems like he has and can bring to the offense. So, there will definitely be some plays and some sequences where you want a guy like Jazz Patterson out there, but it definitely seems like Moulton is a guy that can bring a little bit more to the table overall, which will be interesting to see. Although, I mean, we're also talking RB3 here, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
how many snaps are they going to get necessarily, barring injuries or something, which certainly we don't want to see.
On to the offensive line. Conversation we had last week was about Bo Stevens getting those reps at left guard throughout the summer. And it sounds like, and based on the depth chart, that has kind of continued over and probably will continue into camp. Doesn't mean he's got it locked down by any means, but that's where it's at currently. The rest of that offensive line group is, well, it is what it's been in terms of the starters, with Logan Jones at center, Connor Colby at right guard, Jennings Dunker at right tackle, and then Mason Richmond at left tackle. Now, one thing Kirk made sure to emphasize with that, it was that they feel like they have 7 guys who could start on the offensive line. And obviously it's those starting 5, and then more than likely Nick DeYoung and Tyler Ellsbury. He didn't give any specifics of names, but that's what it looks like. He did talk about Cade Pieper a little bit too, and how he won the Soul and Beef Days hay bale toss. And
Who asked him about that?
Oh, I wonder. And what did he say after? He's like something about, I don't think any of our guys who have won that
are bad.
Like, yeah, right. Like
yeah, there aren't bad players that win that. Yeah.
Right.
And so you can tell that he didn't want to go so far as to say, yeah, and you're going to see that on the field this fall. Like he doesn't talk like that in general, but two, the fact that he's pretty clearly cutting Cade out of that like starting group for now. And I was trying to, like, the reason I asked, one, because people like the Soul and Beef Days hay bale toss, but two, I just wanted to get his temperature and where he thought Cade was going to be going into the season. And I think, based on Ferentz's reaction, that they're excited for him for 2025. They're excited for him to be next in line. But when he's saying 7, and we've seen 7 guys start, not hard to do that math. And I think there's also a little bit of pressure being put on Piper to like get ready to start, like work your way, like be number 8. And they probably don't see that in him yet, but this is sort of his, I don't want to call it a wake-up call, because clearly they trust him a lot, and clearly he's worked his way up the depth chart pretty quick. But this is just one more way of saying, hey, you got a little bit more work to do. So, but clearly they want him to do that work. Clearly they want him to get into that mix. And we know that Ferentz wants more than 7 guys and he can trust on that offensive line, especially with the last few years and how often injuries hit this line. 7 is better than 5. And he mentioned that there were a few times where they were lucky to have 5 out there, but that they want that number to keep coming up by September.
Now, I want to revert back to talking a little bit about that wide receiver group. When somebody asked about John Budmeyer and his ability to coach the receivers, and this has been a bit of a conversation on our premium board. Adam, obviously you were there. Kirk's initial response was, when somebody asked about him, he said, yeah, he's done fine. and
Yeah.
and I just thought that was interesting. And folks on the board have been telling me I'm reading into that too much. It just really appeared like a meh answer to me. And it like almost, you got to, you can tell when Kirk doesn't want to talk about stuff. And
Yeah.
I could feel that a little bit. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't like, oh my God, he's going to fire John Budmeyer. Like that is the
No.
last thing that I was saying. I just got a vibe, like nothing saying that Bud has taken it was like, yeah, he's been awesome. Like we've heard Kirk talk about offensive or not offensive, but just assistants in general, like the way he talks about Abdul Hodge, the way he talks about Seth Wallace, the way he talks about, I mean, like obviously Phil Parker, but it just wasn't that with this how he was talking about Bud. Do you feel like I'm reading into it too much based on what you heard? Maybe I am to a degree, but I really don't feel like I'm being dramatic about how that interaction went.
No, I interpreted it as much as a reflection of what he's seen out of the receivers this year as anything that has to do with Budmeyer in particular. Like that response from him sounded like, yeah, the receivers are coming along. Like they're not wowing him at this point, would be my guess, right? Right. They're not they haven't taken this giant leap into DJK/McNutt territory or the that trio from O2 Ross. I think if we had seen or if Kirk had seen that unit just make a leap over the offseason, there'd probably be a little bit more flowery praise for Budmeyer. But yeah, I don't think it's him already losing faith in the guy that he's hired as wide receiver coach before the team's even played a single game or like taken a single, fall practice or anything like that. That's I hope people don't think that was your interpretation of it, because I mean clearly that's not the case, but it did really seem like, to what you were saying, Kirk doesn't have a whole lot to crow about with the receivers yet. Like he mentioned that Howard's making a few plays. He likes a few things that he's seen out of Buie, but by and large, I think that was a reflection that wide receiver as a unit, as a whole, still a work in progress. And that's kind of what you would expect from a brand new position coach with a brand new offensive coordinator on top of that, with running a brand new scheme. That would be my expectation. So yeah, like fine, doesn't surprise me. And my reaction to that is, yeah, that's fine. Right. It's all fine. It's all fine, guys.
The other thing too is I couldn't hear the question being asked, but I don't feel like by the sound, by the way Kirk responded to it, it was like the guy had asked without any experience coaching wide receivers or without any experience playing the position. And Kirk did kind of come to his defense and saying, yeah, he did that at Colorado State too. So there's a little bit of that as well. So again, my in saying what I said on our board, it wasn't anything of like, oh my God, John Budmeyer is awful. Like that's not what I'm saying. I mean,
hot seat watch.
Right. Just got hired, dog. So anyway, I wanted to ask you about that and see what you thought. The other thing that I know you wanted to share here, Adam, is talking a little bit about Jay Higgins, who Ross is in the middle of writing an article on, and you can check that out on Hawkeye Beacon later today. That'll be available. But Adam, there are a couple things you caught from Jay this weekend, or I guess not this weekend, but this week.
Yeah. So one of the things that I had sort of noticed, even just going back to our last availability, was there's a little bit of reverence for Nick Jackson. And so I just wanted to ask Jay, like, what's it been like? How happy are you to see Jackson back? And also, like, how is he growing now that he's got this full year? And what I was expecting was, I mean, there's no such thing as a stock standard answer from Jay Higgins. We already know that to begin with, but like he gives me this 90-second response about, well, one, he says, I told Nick I was going to do this. I'm very high on Nick Jackson. So that was two things that really jumped out to me about that. One was he's got a really just effusive appreciation for Nick. And two, he was waiting for somebody to ask him about it. And so I was happy. I was really like almost honored to be the one that did ask. But he mentioned that, you know, Nick had come from Virginia and had a solidified career, as Jay said. Jay credited him with 400 tackles for the Cavs. It was actually 360. So get your facts right, Jay. No, but
it's the damn
he also
liberal media. Sorry, go ahead.
hard to listen to when you get facts wrong. But the fact that, and I had never really considered this specific aspect of it, but he said, you know, he came from UVA, 3-year starter, solid career, this many tackles. He transfers to Iowa to play next to a guy who had never played before. And he's referring to himself. And he says that must have been hard. And yet, you know, we have never heard from Nick, had never heard from any of the coaches, from Wallace or anybody else, that was going to be difficult, that was difficult, or that there was, right? Like the only difficulty that we ever heard coming from Nick or from Wallace was learning a brand new playbook in 3 months, you know, just getting fire hosed like that, because he had to join the team later than most, because he had to actually, you know, graduate from the University of Virginia first. He's got a finance degree from there. So the fact that it took Jay Higgins to be such a good teammate to put himself in his teammate's shoes and say, hey man, not a whole lot of people could have done what he did, but it made the defense better. And it goes to show Nick's leadership. I thought that was really remarkable. But also I was only like, I wasn't all that surprised that it came from Jay Higgins too, because that guy is a consummate leader, a consummate teammate, friend, communicator within that defense. Yeah, so, you know, it's on my Twitter, that full clip. So I think that we've reposted it on Hawkeye Beacon as well. But yeah, go find that clip, because it was a coach hearing that sort of answer out of his player's mouth has got to make that coach's day. Has got to, because that is a guy that just gets it.
The other thing I tweeted this out about Jay is just like the growth that he's made, not only on the football field, but like as a personality. And even from the beginning of the season to the end of the season last year, like there's a reason he got that award for being, is it cooperative with the media? I don't remember. I don't know what the exact award is, but his personality has come through, and you can see the relation between him and Hawk for sure. Like just the personality that they bring to the table, and Jay is always willing to hype up his teammates. He'll talk about what he brings to the table, and I mean, he's gonna be in line for the Butkus Award, like potentially Defensive Player of the Year in the Big Ten, potentially nationally. And I mean, he should have been all of those things last year. Wasn't a finalist for the Butkus Award with 171 tackles, I think, which was just, you can quote me on this, absolute horseshit. And
yeah,
now it's just a joy to interact with him every time. And I don't know that Jay knows my name, but like I'm happy to say that about him and what he's brought to the table, not only in terms of, you know, playing in the football field, but as interacting with the media too. He's just fun. Like, and Ross got dibs on writing that article, and I was like, damn it, because I wanted to write it too. But there are some clips that I think I'm going to go through and share from Media Day of Jay here soon. Ross, I guess
it's the Duke Slater Golden Gavel Award.
There we go. Cool.
Yeah.
Ross, what's your focus going to be? Because there are so many different things that Jay hit on at Big Ten Media Days.
Yeah, I mean, I think just talking about, you know, his growth and his leadership and what he's looking to do with this one final year at Iowa, I think is probably going to be the main focus. But there's just a lot of, you know, great sound bites and anecdotes he had too. So lot to work with.
Another common theme at Big Ten Media Days is talking about the college football playoff and some questions that Iowa players and I think Kirk received as well about the 12-team playoff ahead. And with that in mind, we did get a question from Waterloo Chaz last week that we did not answer. And I want to tie this all in together because the players and Kirk, it sounds like that's their goal, right? And it's not like they're going to say, no, we don't think we can make it, right? But being one of the top 12
Keep dreaming, buddy.
right. Top 12 teams in the country is realistic, especially if the offense continues to move forward under Tim Lester, right? Like that's just the qualifier everybody wants and has been saying.
Yeah, it's absolutely realistic. And, it's not only well, I think they could, if you look back at Kirk's history, you know, if it had been a 12-team playoff starting in 1999, there would have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different years that Iowa would have made the playoff. Kirk would have been making the playoff 20% of the time if that had been standard for his entire career. So,
I'm sure they would have been on the fringe of it a couple of those years that they didn't make it to.
Yeah, they would have been pretty close. So that is and when we see where Iowa's been sort of placed in preseason watch lists and we saw them ranked 5th in the cleveland.com poll, that is right on the outside of number 12 nationally. And so that's the sort of thing where you just need one game to go your way and take care of business on the rest. And that has always sort of been Kirk's MO, especially as these team seasons get into November, especially as that wind really starts to suck at Kinnick and the rest of those Big Ten North, Big Ten West, rest in peace, venues. But you get that wind coming off the plains where there's nothing between you and Alberta except some cows. That is Iowa football weather. And, all of a sudden you go 10-2, you start to have better things to look forward to than the Outback Bowl or the whatever the hell they call it now. Call it Outback again. Come on. So yeah, I think it is a plausible goal. And there have been years where Iowa was not, ranked even in the top 25 and ends up in that top 10, top 12, top 15 sort of area too. I mean, there are numerous Iowa fans who get anxious when Iowa is ranked in a preseason top 25. They're like, no, we need to come out of nowhere. We need to take teams by surprise. That usually works better for us. That's usually the common refrain. So, one, I don't put a ton of stock into those top 25s to begin with, but two, we have seen Iowa get itself into that conversation, into that sort of more elite space, regardless of where people think, how good they are at the beginning of the season. It's better to start ranked than not ranked. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, I think it's an absolutely realistic goal, especially like you said, and as is going to be said another 5,000 times before the season starts, if the offense comes together, I think they think it's coming together. I really do. It just, there's not that sort of like hedging that you get like when we asked Lachey, when we ask other players like how you see that offense coming along. They're not, some of it's measured, but some of it's like they don't try to end on it's a work in progress. We'll see, right? Like there is genuine optimism about the offense. And if that comes to fruition, of course, a top 12 finish is in play. It's not a guarantee. Football's a long season and a lot of weird things happen, but it's absolutely in play. Ross, do you agree?
Yes. Yeah, I would agree that it is definitely a realistic possibility. For all the reasons you said, the offense is obviously the gigantic flashing lights question mark around everything. But yeah, I think with this defense and frankly this schedule, it's something that is on the table. And so then it becomes a matter of what can you do, on a week-to-week basis to keep moving forward towards that goal and keep it as a viable option. I was just going to turn it around to you guys. What do you think is 10-2 the mark? Is that they have to be at least 10-2 to be in consideration for the playoff?
So this got brought up on another podcast, and I think it's accurate, especially with this schedule.
Yeah.
I think it has to be 11-1 because of the weakness of the schedule, unless Wisconsin becomes something awesome or
They're just
Nebraska.
there just aren't any marquee wins really outside of that Ohio State, which you're
Exactly.
penciling that as the one in 11-1. I'm assuming.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, in these coming years, the schedule gets a lot more tough. 10-2 then would make more sense. But you're also factoring in auto bids from these group of 5 programs. So that makes Iowa have to be a top 10 program in the country, maybe a top 9, top 8 program in the country, because it's not it's about those rankings, right? And the auto bids. And so I mean, and do you have to be competitive with Ohio State to a degree even? Because if you get absolutely shellacked and then barely win the rest of these games, like Iowa tends to do, does the committee think you're good enough?
Guys, Washington finished number 2 in the nation last year.
Okay.
Why are we not talking?
All right.
I don't even believe that. Delete your angry comments.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Elliot, that the Iowa, I think, has that possibility, but their margin of error does seem like it could be very small this year because of just the lack of opportunities on that schedule to really make impressive statements, without, unless they can shock Ohio State in the shoe, which would be, that would be a tremendous statement, obviously. So then it just becomes kind of a volume game in terms of getting those wins. And also, like you said, like kind of looking, it is still going to be a little bit of a beauty pageant aspect in looking more impressive. Like, if I was grinding out like these 12-10 wins on a, late field goal or a punt return score or something, like that's exciting, but it may not be what the committee is looking for in terms of, finding the 12 best teams.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at last year. They that was a 10-win team, and they almost finished outside of the top 25. And some of that is just that beauty pageant aspect, like you talked about. And then one more thing to just sort of keep in consideration is these rankings are Iowa being judged next to everybody else. So a lot of it's just going to come down to what everybody else's seasons look like. So yeah, they do need a little bit of help from Wisconsin being good, one, but also they don't need Wisconsin to be better than Iowa. It would really help if Wisconsin or if Washington and UCLA, if they're good, but also not better than Iowa, right? So a lot of things sort of have to like fall into place. Like over in the SEC, how many other teams are going to have 10 wins in the regular season, right? What's that's the situation with the ACC going to look like? How many great teams are going to come out of that too? So a lot of information that we just have no way of knowing ahead of time. But yeah, as you talk about that and mention it, Eliot, I think I'm sort of falling into the probably need 11 win camp too. But if that's the case, then Iowa probably plays itself into the Big Ten championship, because there's probably not going to be a whole lot of other teams in the conference that work that get to an 11-1 season.
And then what if they get smacked in the Big Ten championship by Oregon? Does that leave them out?
Maybe not. But you also I don't think that they should punish teams, especially in an 18-team Big Ten. I don't think a team should be punished all that much for losing a conference championship. If it's a 40-50 point blowout and it's, a function of, I can't believe I'm talking myself into this in real time. But if it's a function of a weak schedule as much, yeah, I can see how voters would sort of cool on a team like that. But I don't think that it's necessarily fair to reward a team for finishing outside of a conference championship game and watching a team that did better than them just get spanked and be like, oh, we'll take that spot instead. Like, well, you should have earned your way in there first. So I hope that there is a little bit of consideration built into that, but we'll see, because we have no idea how they're going to handle that. There's no precedent to fall back on. So brave new world.
And additionally, Adam, I'll address that point that you just made too about other teams. I mean, yes, it's a 12-team playoff, but Oregon, Ohio State, Florida State, Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma. That's 8 teams I just rattled off. And then you factor in the Liberties of the world. And then what about there's inevitably going to be a team that comes out of nowhere and is really freaking good. There's going to be a Big 12 team in there, Utah. Like, that's just off the top of my head. I'm not even looking at all 130 FBS teams. Like, there's going to be some really good teams to compete with. And Iowa's offense is going to have to be at least mediocre, maybe a little bit worse than mediocre, considering how damn good the defense is, but somewhere near mediocre to be among the best 12 teams in the country, because they were not last year. They just weren't. The offense was, or excuse me, the defense was, the offense was not. Not even freaking close. And that's
and the defense only brought them so far too, because ultimately, and a big part of this was a function of, the offensive struggles. But you look at those 3 shutout losses. 1, they got shut out, but 2, they gave up over 30 points a game in those losses.
96-0 in those 3 games.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not even a field goal, baby. Drew Stevens, what the hell? Sorry, just kidding.
Yeah.
Marshall
92,
Meter.
I believe.
Anyway.
Like, not that it's better, but 92-0 in those 3 games. Regardless,
I was told
the defense can only do so
podcast.
much.
Wasn't it 96? Because it was 35-0 to Penn State, 35-0 to Tennessee, and then 26-0 to Michigan.
Penn State was 31.
Really?
I'm looking at Jay Howell right now.
Oh, well, shut up, Eliot. Okay, math is hard. All right.
Just getting back to a point that, you guys both kind of talked about is, that conference championship game, and what does that do to the your hopes of making the playoff? Because it's another game. It's a possibility to get another win, which would be great. And if you win, you get the auto bid. So, hey, you're gold. But it's also a chance to, unfortunately, get another loss. So if you're 10-2, now you're 10-3. If you're 11-1, now you're 11-2. And, like Adam said, feels like you shouldn't be penalized for that. But we also don't know, what the committee is going to do, how they're going to treat that game. And like Eliot said, Eliot, does it matter how the game goes? Like, if Iowa loses 40-10 to Oregon or something, not a good final statement, when you're making your case.
And like, if they get destroyed by Ohio State in the regular season and then get destroyed by Oregon in the regular season, that's a perfect recipe to get Oregon or Ohio State in above them, even if they make it to the Big Ten championship game. Yeah. College football, folks. It makes folks like us want to drink. Anyway, we'll wrap up all the hypotheticals.
I can't believe we just talked everybody out of Iowa as a college football playoff team.
Oops.
In a matter of 5 minutes.
I think we're doing this wrong.
Yeah. That's our bad. Hey, it's up to Iowa to change our minds. How's that?
That's right.
Absolutely.
We're just journalists.
Yeah, that's all we do. Big J journalism. We'll wrap up the hypotheticals here. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of HawkCast. If you're not a subscriber yet, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, do that today, especially on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like, drop a comment. Can Iowa make that college football playoff? What do you think about the quarterback situation with the Hawkeyes? Is Bo Stevens going to be the starting left guard? What do you think about the receivers? Tim Lester. So many things to talk about with Iowa football. And again, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, leave that rate and review. It helps us out a lot. It makes us very happy. And if you're not a premium subscriber yet, on iowa.rivals.com, you can do that today. We have a absolute ton of premium content coming at you right now. Not only premium content, but free content. If you're not a premium subscriber, that will hopefully lead you to joining us on the boards and getting all that premium content with recruiting, with football, with especially men's basketball recruiting. Tons of top 150 players in the country set to take official visits. We got all the intel on that and so much more. So thanks so much for tuning in once again. I am Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter, joined by Ross Binder and Adam Jacoby for this episode of HawkCast. We will see you next time.